HMP Berwyn, Wales' biggest prison, criticised for health, violence and education. Imagine a prison built on a promise. Not just a promise to lock people away, but a promise to change them. To rehabilitate them. To send them back into the world as better human beings than when they arrived. That was the vision. That was what the architect said. What the government said. What the headlines said when this facility first opened its doors in the hills of North Wales. A brand new, state-of-the-art facility. Modern cells. Education classrooms. Mental health support. Vocational training. Everything a broken system had always lacked, finally, put under one roof. They called it the future of criminal justice. But behind those brand new walls, behind those freshly painted corridors and gleaming facilities, something was going wrong. Violence was rising. Healthcare was failing. Men were suffering. And nobody in power seemed willing to admit just how badly this so-called model prison had already started to crack. This is the story of HMP Berwyn, Wales' biggest prison. A facility designed to be different, that ended up being a brutal reminder of everything wrong with Britain's broken prison system. And tonight, we are going inside. We are going to look at every inspection report, every scandal, every moment of violence, neglect, and institutional failure that the government did not want you to see. We are going to hear what prisoners experienced. What staff endured. What investigators found when they finally walked through those doors with clipboards and cameras and the power to publish the truth. Because the truth about HMP Berwyn is not what you were told. It never was. Before we dive in, drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you from all corners of the world. If you enjoy true crime stories and real documentary content like this, please take 2 seconds to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this with someone who would love it too. It genuinely helps us keep making content like this. Now, let's go inside. The birth of a promise, how HMP Berwyn came to be. To understand what went wrong at HMP Berwyn, you have to understand what it was supposed to be. Because this was not supposed to be just another prison. The story begins more than a decade before the first prisoner ever walked through its gates. In the early 2010s, the United Kingdom's prison system was in a state of visible collapse. Prisons were dangerously overcrowded. Violence was at record levels. Rehabilitation rates were dismal. Men were serving sentences and coming back out into the world having learned nothing, changed nothing, improved nothing, and the cycle of reoffending was grinding on, costing the country billions and ruining thousands of lives. Politicians, criminologists, and prison reform advocates were all screaming the same thing: the system was broken. Something radical had to change. And in 2012, the then Justice Secretary made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the criminal justice world. A brand new prison would be built. Not just any prison. The largest prison in Wales. One of the largest in the entire United Kingdom. A facility capable of housing over 2,000 men at full capacity. And it wouldn't just be big, it would be different. The location chosen was Wrexham. A town in northeast Wales, sitting at the foot of the Berwyn Mountains. A post-industrial area that had seen better days economically, where the arrival of a major employer, even a prison, was welcomed by many in the community. Construction began. And when the plans were published, they genuinely looked extraordinary by UK prison standards. There would be no dark Victorian wings. No crumbling Victorian architecture. No overcrowded dormitories. Instead, the designs showed clean, modern residential blocks. Individual cells that were spacious by prison standards, each with their own toilet facilities. Classrooms and education centers. Vocational training workshops. A gym. Healthcare facilities. Mental health support units. A dedicated space where prisoners could receive family visits in a dignified, comfortable environment rather than across a table in a grim visiting hall. The language used by officials was almost revolutionary. Words like rehabilitation, dignity, opportunity, transformation. The then Justice Minister spoke about a new era for Welsh justice. About a facility that would demonstrate what a modern, humane, and effective prison could look like. About men leaving HMP Berwyn not as hardened criminals, but as employable, supported, engaged members of society. It sounded, frankly, too good to be true. And as we now know, in many crucial ways, it was. On the 27th of February 2017, HMP Berwyn officially opened its doors. The first prisoners began arriving. They came from other prisons across Wales and the north of England. Many had never seen anything like it. The cells were clean. The facilities were new. The staff, a mix of experienced prison officers and fresh recruits who had bought into the vision, were, by many accounts, trying their hardest in the early days. But from the very beginning, there were warning signs that those in charge chose to ignore. The prison had been designed to hold over 2,000 men. But the staffing levels, the healthcare provision, the educational resources, none of them had been planned to actually function at that capacity from day one. The infrastructure was there. The people and the systems to run it properly, that was a different story. And then the problems began to arrive. Not all at once. Not with one dramatic explosion. But slowly, steadily, like water creeping under a door, the cracks in the HMP Berwyn experiment started to show. Within the first year, reports began filtering out. Violence between prisoners. Staffing pressures. Healthcare waiting lists. Men with serious mental health conditions being held in inadequate conditions. Drugs finding their way inside despite the modern security setup. The vision of a humane, rehabilitative future for prison in Wales was already, within 12 months of opening, beginning to look like a very expensive mirage. The first inspection, what the inspectors found. When Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, the independent watchdog responsible for scrutinizing conditions inside UK prisons, made their first formal inspection visit to HMP Berwyn, the prison had been open for just over a year. The inspectors were experienced. They had been inside the worst prisons in England and Wales. They had seen Victorian jails rotting from the inside out. They had documented violence, squalor, drug dependency, and institutional neglect across dozens of facilities over many years. But HMP Berwyn presented something slightly different. This wasn't an old, crumbling building held together with bureaucratic tape and underfunding. This was a brand new facility. The infrastructure was modern and clean. The intentions, at least on paper, remained good. And the inspectors recognized that. But even in those early inspection findings, between the careful, measured language of official reports, the warning signs were unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read them. The inspectors found that while the physical environment at HMP Berwyn was genuinely better than most UK prisons, the new cells, the clean facilities, the layout, the operational reality of life inside was already diverging sharply from what had been promised. Healthcare was one of the first serious concerns to emerge. Men were waiting weeks, in some cases longer, to see a GP. The healthcare provision, which had been trumpeted as a major pillar of the rehabilitation model, was struggling under the sheer weight of demand. Remember, this is a prison designed to hold over 2,000 men. Men who arrive with pre-existing physical health conditions. Men with histories of drug and alcohol dependency. Men with serious mental health problems, often undiagnosed or poorly managed before their incarceration. The healthcare team was too small. The waiting lists were growing. Men with urgent medical needs were not being seen quickly enough. And crucially, the mental health support provision, which had been positioned as central to the Berwyn vision, was identified as inadequate for the scale of need inside the prison. Mental health is not a minor side issue in a prison environment. Across UK prisons, the rate of mental health conditions among the prison population is dramatically higher than in the general public. Serious mental illness. Anxiety and depression at crisis levels. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Personality disorders. Substance addiction intertwined with mental illness. The prison population carries an enormous mental health burden, and that burden had arrived at HMP Berwyn without the resources needed to properly address it. Violence was the second major concern. In the first inspection, inspectors noted that violence levels at Berwyn were higher than the inspectorate would expect for a prison of its type and security category. The facility operates as a Category C prison. That means it houses men who are not considered the highest risk, but who are not trusted in open conditions either. These are men serving medium to long sentences. Men in the middle of their journey through the prison system. Category C prisons are not supposed to be the most violent environments. But the violence statistics at HMP Berwyn were moving in the wrong direction even in those early years. Assaults between prisoners. Assaults on staff. Incidents that should have been manageable escalating into something more serious. And the emerging consensus among those who monitored these statistics was that drugs, specifically synthetic cannabinoids, a family of substances sometimes called spice, were a primary driver. Spice had become an epidemic across UK prisons in the years around HMP Berwyn's opening. It was cheap. It was extremely difficult to detect through standard urine testing. It could be sprayed onto paper and sent through the post or smuggled in through other means, and even in a modern, brand new facility with modern security, it was finding its way inside. The effects of synthetic cannabinoids on users are severe and unpredictable. Men under the influence of spice could become violently aggressive, profoundly paranoid, or completely incapacitated within minutes. The drug was destabilizing prison wings across the country, and Berwyn was no exception. Education and vocational training, the headline promises of the whole Berwyn project, were also underperforming in ways that the inspectors documented carefully. Yes, the classrooms existed. Yes, the workshops were there. But participation rates were lower than expected. The quality of provision was inconsistent. And crucially, the link between the education happening inside the prison and real employment outcomes on the outside, the whole point of it all, was weak and poorly evidenced. Men were sitting in classes. But whether those classes were actually changing anything, actually giving these men the tools and credentials to find work when they left, that was a far harder question to answer. And the honest answer, in those early years, was, not reliably. Not consistently. Not at the scale that had been promised. The first inspection of HMP Berwyn was not a total condemnation. The inspectors acknowledged the genuine efforts of many of the staff. They noted the quality of the physical environment. They recognized that the prison was still new, still finding its feet. But they also put down in black and white the concerns that would haunt HMP Berwyn for years to come. Healthcare, inadequate. Violence, concerning. Education delivery, inconsistent. Mental health support, insufficient. The promise of the prison had already, within a year, collided with the brutal reality of what it meant to actually run a facility housing thousands of human beings, many of them with complex, layered, deeply rooted needs, on a budget that had never really been adequate for the vision being sold. And things were about to get worse. Violence behind the walls, the full picture. Let's talk about the violence at HMP Berwyn. Because the statistics, when you actually look at them properly, are not abstract numbers. They represent real confrontations. Real injuries. Real fear. Real trauma, for prisoners and for the men and women who go to work in that building every day. By the time investigators and journalists began digging into publicly available Ministry of Justice data in the years following HMP Berwyn's opening, the numbers were alarming. Assaults, both prison-on-prisoner and prison-on staff, were running at levels significantly above what should be expected from a prison of its security category and relative newness. Other Category C prisons across England and Wales did not show comparable rates. Berwyn was an outlier, and the scale of the facility meant that those outlier rates represented large numbers of actual incidents. To put this in human terms, in a prison housing 2,000 men, even a moderate rate of serious violence translates into hundreds of incidents per year. Hundreds of men being physically attacked. Hundreds of staff members working in an environment where the threat of assault was a daily reality. But what was driving this violence? To understand that, you have to understand the specific population that HMP Berwyn holds, and the specific pressures that exist within that population. First, as we've already touched on, drugs. Specifically synthetic cannabinoids. Spice, black mamba, and other related substances had become the dominant illicit drug problem in UK prisons by the mid-2010s, and Berwyn was in the thick of it. The reason these drugs create so much violence is complex but consistent across multiple prison environments. First, the drugs themselves cause volatile, unpredictable behavior. Men under the influence of spice have been documented becoming violently aggressive with almost no warning. Prison staff describe situations where a man was calm one moment and attacking another prisoner or an officer seconds later, apparently triggered by the drug's effect on perception and impulse control. Second, and this is crucial, the trade in these drugs inside the prison creates its own violent ecosystem. Drugs in prison are currency. They are power. Men in debt for drugs face violence if they can't pay. Men who control the supply of drugs have power over others, and they enforce that power through intimidation and physical force. The drug economy inside any prison is not a passive thing. It generates violence as a natural byproduct. In a prison the size of HMP Berwyn, with over 2,000 men, dozens of wing sections, multiple opportunities for drug introduction despite security measures, the scale of this problem was substantial. But drugs were not the only driver of violence. Staffing levels played a significant role. And this is something the inspectors, the Prison Officers Association, and independent analysts all pointed to consistently. HMP Berwyn opened with an ambitious staffing model that relied, in part, on technology, on in-cell TV systems, on intercoms, on digital management tools, to reduce the need for direct staff presence on wings. The theory was that a more autonomous, technology-enabled prison could be run with fewer staff per prisoner than older facilities. In practice, this meant that at times, the staff-to-prisoner ratio on certain wings was not adequate to maintain safe, stable control. When incidents escalated, when a fight broke out, when a prisoner became acutely mentally unwell, when tensions on a wing reached a tipping point, there were not always enough officers in the right places to contain the situation before it turned serious. Staff who worked at HMP Berwyn during this period described a workplace under strain. The prison was large. Very large. The sheer geography of the facility meant that officers could be covering enormous distances during a shift. The physical and psychological demands were significant. And when staff numbers were stretched, the environment on the wings could deteriorate quickly. There is also the question of the specific men inside HMP Berwyn, and the complex histories many of them bring. This is not a criticism of prisoners as people. It is an acknowledgement of reality. Men in Category C prisons are typically serving sentences of several years for serious offenses. Many have backgrounds of significant trauma, poverty, abuse, addiction, and untreated mental illness. Many have been through multiple prison sentences. Many carry deep-seated patterns of behavior developed in environments where violence was normalized or even necessary for survival. To actually address those patterns, to help a man who has spent 15 or 20 years managing danger through aggression learn a fundamentally different way of being, requires intensive, consistent, evidence-based intervention. It requires skilled staff, therapeutic programs, time. And what was documented at HMP Berwyn in the inspections and external reviews was that access to those kinds of meaningful interventions was inconsistent at best, inadequate at worst. Men were sitting in cells for more hours than was healthy. Structured activity, the education, the workshops, the programs, was not reaching all prisoners consistently. And when men are locked in their cells for long periods with limited stimulation, limited agency, and unresolved tension, violence is almost an inevitable outcome. Then there is the issue of self-harm and suicide, forms of violence directed inward, which paint an equally troubling picture of the psychological distress inside Berwyn. The rates of self-harm among prisoners at HMP Berwyn were documented as concerning in multiple inspection reports. Men were hurting themselves. Men were in crisis. And the ability of the prison to respond to that crisis, through the healthcare system, through mental health support, through staff trained to recognize and respond to deteriorating mental health, was repeatedly questioned by inspectors. There is a specific protocol used in UK prisons when a prisoner is identified as at risk of self-harm or suicide, called account, the assessment, care in custody and teamwork process. The quality of account management at HMP Berwyn was highlighted as an area of concern, with inspectors noting that care plans were not always of sufficient quality, and that the level of engagement and oversight of at-risk prisoners was not consistently meeting the required standard. These were not bureaucratic failings. These were potentially life-or-death gaps in a system that was supposed to be keeping vulnerable men safe. And underlying all of it, the violence between prisoners, the assaults on staff, the self-harm, the drug-fueled chaos, was an uncomfortable truth that nobody in the Ministry of Justice seemed particularly eager to confront. HMP Berwyn had been built with a vision of rehabilitation as its core identity. But the resources, the staffing, the commissioning of services, the day-to-day operational reality, none of it had ever truly matched the scale of that vision. The gap between the promise and the practice was creating suffering. Real, documented, measurable suffering. And the inspectors kept writing their reports. And the Ministry of Justice kept issuing their responses. And the men inside HMP Berwyn kept living through it. The healthcare crisis, when the system fails the most vulnerable. Of all the criticisms that have been leveled at HMP Berwyn over the years, the failures in healthcare have perhaps been the most persistent. The most documented. And in human terms, the most devastating. Because healthcare failures in a prison do not just mean inconvenience. They do not mean waiting an extra few days for a prescription. In the most serious cases, and there have been serious cases at HMP Berwyn, they mean deteriorating physical conditions going untreated. They mean men with serious mental illness left without adequate support. They mean individuals in crisis not receiving the intervention that could save their lives. To understand the scale of this problem, we need to start with a fundamental reality of the UK prison system. The National Health Service is legally responsible for healthcare in prisons in England and Wales. This sounds, on paper, like a protection. Like a guarantee that the standard of care inside a prison should be equivalent, or at least approximately equivalent, to what a member of the public would receive in the community. In practice, commissioning healthcare for prisons is enormously challenging. The prison population has a health profile dramatically worse than the general public in almost every dimension. Higher rates of chronic physical illness. Catastrophically higher rates of mental health conditions. Rates of substance dependency that dwarf the general population. Complex, layered, interconnected health needs that require not just individual clinical services but integrated, coordinated care across multiple disciplines. And all of this has to be delivered inside a secure environment with all the logistical complications that creates. Accessing healthcare inside a prison requires movement, escorted movement through security. Medication has to be managed carefully to prevent diversion and misuse. Mental health assessments have to happen in consultation rooms inside a secure building. Getting a prisoner to an outside hospital appointment requires security staff and planning. Every element of healthcare delivery in a prison is harder, slower, and more complex than in the outside world. At HMP Berwyn, from a very early stage, inspection reports and external reviews highlighted that the commissioned healthcare service was not adequate for the scale and complexity of need presenting inside the prison. Waiting times for GP appointments were documented as too long. In a prison environment, delays in accessing a GP can have real consequences, conditions deteriorating that could have been managed earlier, men in pain waiting weeks for basic medical attention, urgent presentations being inadequately screened at the initial stage. Dental care was a particular flashpoint. Access to dental treatment at HMP Berwyn was documented as a genuine problem. Across UK prisons, dental health is consistently one of the most reported complaints, and Berwyn was no exception. Men with significant dental pain waiting extended periods for treatment. A fundamental aspect of physical dignity and health being inadequately provided. But it was in the realm of mental health where the most serious questions were raised. The profile of the mental health need inside HMP Berwyn was, as at virtually every large UK prison, substantial. Estimates across the wider prison system suggest that a significant majority of prisoners have at least one diagnosable mental health condition. At HMP Berwyn, with over 2,000 men, this translates to a very large number of individuals requiring mental health support of some kind, from relatively straightforward counseling and anxiety management right through to acute, serious mental illness requiring intensive psychiatric input. The mental health team inside the prison, employed through the commissioned NHS provider, was, by multiple accounts, doing their best in extremely difficult circumstances. Individual practitioners working hard within a system that was not giving them the resources, the staffing levels, or the referral pathways they needed to do their jobs properly. But the gap between the need and the provision was documented clearly by inspectors and independent reviewers. Men with serious mental illness waiting too long for assessment and treatment. The pathway to transfer to a secure psychiatric hospital, for men so unwell that a prison environment was completely inappropriate for their condition, moving far too slowly. Under the relevant legislation, a prisoner can be transferred to a secure psychiatric hospital if they meet the clinical criteria. In practice, the wait for such a transfer can stretch to months. And in those months, profoundly mentally ill men are living in prison conditions that are not only inappropriate but actively harmful to their condition. Inspectors consistently raised concerns about the consistency and quality of account management, the safeguarding process for prisoners identified as at risk of self-harm or suicide. Not enough, at HMP Berwyn, was working as it should. The documentation of care plans was not always of the required standard. The frequency of meaningful reviews of at-risk prisoners was not always what the process requires. And when things go wrong in these systems, when a man in crisis does not receive the contact, the assessment, the human connection that might make the difference, the consequences can be permanent. The issue of substance misuse treatment also deserves specific attention. A very significant proportion of men entering HMP Berwyn arrive with active substance dependencies. Heroin, crack cocaine, alcohol, novel psychoactive substances. Often multiple substances simultaneously. And alongside those physical dependencies are all the psychological and social factors that underpin them. Trauma, hopelessness, untreated mental illness, social exclusion. The Substance Misuse Treatment Service commissioned for HMP Berwyn was supposed to provide structured programs, substitute prescribing where clinically indicated, detoxification support, and onward recovery planning. In the early years and beyond, however, the quality and reach of this provision was repeatedly questioned. Not enough men were being reached. Not enough were engaging meaningfully with treatment. And the presence of spice inside the prison, which was, in part, being used by men as a substitute for controlled substances, precisely because it was harder to detect, was complicating the clinical picture enormously. There is a deep irony in this particular failure at HMP Berwyn. One of the explicit goals of the rehabilitation model that the prison was built around was to address the substance dependencies that drove so much of the reoffending cycle. To meet men where they were clinically. To help them achieve stability and recovery. And in the commissioning and operational reality of the prison, this goal was being undermined by inadequate resources, by the spice epidemic, and by a healthcare system that was stretched far beyond its capacity. The men who came to HMP Berwyn with addictions were, in too many cases, leaving HMP Berwyn still addicted. Or had replaced one addiction with another, harder to treat one. Healthcare at HMP Berwyn was not a complete failure. There were dedicated professionals doing genuinely important work in difficult conditions. There were individual cases where the system worked as it should. But the systemic picture, the picture painted by inspectors who visited independently and repeatedly, by the data, by the testimony of men who had lived through it, was of a healthcare system chronically underfunded, understaffed, and under-resourced relative to the scale of need inside one of the largest prisons in Wales. And behind every statistic in those inspection reports, behind every inadequate rating and every concern flagged, there was a man. A real man. With a real body. A real mind. Real pain. Real suffering. That is what healthcare failure in a prison actually looks like. The broken promise, education and rehabilitation failures. If you want to understand the true depth of disappointment surrounding HMP Berwyn, you have to go back to the single most important promise that was made when this prison was announced to the world. Not the promise of security. Not the promise of order. Not the promise of containing dangerous men behind thick walls. The promise of change. The promise that HMP Berwyn would be, at its heart, a place of transformation. Where men who had made catastrophic decisions, men who had hurt people, broken lives, and broken their own lives in the process, would be given genuine, meaningful, practical tools to become different. Education was supposed to be the engine of that transformation. The plans for HMP Berwyn included dedicated education facilities that, by prison standards, were genuinely impressive. Proper classrooms. IT suites. Library resources. Workshop spaces for vocational training in trades with real employment demand, construction skills, painting and decorating, catering, warehousing, logistics. Courses accredited by recognized awarding bodies so that the qualifications earned inside could actually be used outside. Partnerships with employers who had committed, at least in principle, to considering ex-offenders for jobs. The vision was not naive in its conception. The architects of the Berwyn model understood that sustainable rehabilitation required a connection to the real economy, that education inside the prison walls had to be genuinely connected to jobs and opportunities on the outside. There is overwhelming evidence in the criminology literature that stable employment is one of the strongest protective factors against reoffending. Get a man a job, a real job, with dignity and income, and the likelihood of him coming back to prison drops significantly. But by the time inspectors began systematically reviewing the education and purposeful activity offer at HMP Berwyn, the gap between that vision and the operational reality was vast and deeply troubling. Time out of cell, a fundamental measure used by prison inspectors to assess whether prisoners are actually engaged in meaningful activity during the day, was consistently below what inspectors expected and what the prison's own stated model required. In a prison designed around the principle that structured activity during the day was the vehicle for rehabilitation, having large numbers of men locked in their cells for extended periods was a direct contradiction of the entire model. The reasons for this were multiple and interconnected, and none of them were simple to fix. Staffing constraints meant that there were not always enough officers available to escort prisoners to education and workshop activities. If a wing is short-staffed on a particular day, movement around the prison is restricted. If movement is restricted, men stay in their cells. And if men stay in their cells consistently, because staffing shortfalls become the norm rather than the exception, the education and activity timetable effectively collapses in practice even while it continues to look fine on paper. The education provider contracted to deliver learning inside HMP Berwyn also faced their own challenges. Recruiting qualified teachers and tutors willing to work inside a large prison, with all the security requirements, the logistical complexity, and the challenging classroom dynamic that entails, is not straightforward. Retaining them is even harder. Staff turnover in prison education has historically been high, and at a large, relatively remote facility like Berwyn, finding and keeping quality educators was an ongoing struggle. What this meant in practice was that the consistency of educational provision was poor. Classes were cancelled. Courses were disrupted. Men who had enrolled in programs found themselves unable to complete them due to lockdowns, staffing shortfalls, or the simple logistics of a facility under operational strain. The vocational training workshops, which had been specifically designed to give men marketable skills in trades with genuine employment demand, also underperformed. Workshop access was inconsistent. The number of men actively engaged in purposeful vocational training at any given time was, by the inspector's assessments, far below what the prison's capacity and model should have been delivering. There is a particular cruelty in this specific failure that deserves to be named clearly. The men who come to HMP Berwyn, many of them, want to engage. This is something that is frequently misunderstood about the prison population. The stereotype of the prisoner who doesn't want to change, who is happy to sit in a cell, who has no interest in education or work, that stereotype does not reflect the reality of the majority of the prison population. Most men in prison, given a genuine, meaningful opportunity to learn something, to build a skill, to feel productive and capable, will take it. Because the alternative is a cell. And a cell, especially for a man serving years of his life, is a form of slow psychological erosion. When those opportunities are not reliably available, when courses are cancelled, when workshops are locked, when the education unit is accessible only intermittently because there aren't enough officers to run the movement, the effect on men's mental health is real and documented. Hopelessness increases. Tension increases. The sense that the system's promises were empty, that they were never real, takes hold. And that psychological deterioration feeds back into the violence statistics. Back into the self-harm statistics. Back into the healthcare crisis. Everything at HMP Berwyn was interconnected, and at the center of the web was the failure to deliver on the one promise that justified this prison's existence: genuine, consistent, high-quality rehabilitation. Inspectorate of Prisons gave HMP Berwyn its lowest possible rating, poor, for purposeful activity in a damning inspection. That is the bottom of the scale. The worst possible assessment. In a prison that was specifically designed and specifically funded and specifically marketed as a place where purposeful activity was the defining characteristic, receiving the lowest possible rating for exactly that category was a condemnation so total, so direct, that it was difficult for any government official to spin. And yet, as we will see, the spinning continued. The prison issued its responses to inspection findings. The Ministry of Justice issued its action plans. Improvements were promised. Timelines were set. And the men inside HMP Berwyn sat in their cells, waiting for a transformation that, for too many of them, never quite arrived. The damning reports, what inspectors said in their own words. There is a particular power in reading the actual words of official inspection reports. Not the press releases. Not the government responses. Not the carefully managed ministerial statements designed to neutralize bad news and project confidence. The actual reports. The documents produced by independent inspectors who walked into HMP Berwyn, spent days inside the facility, interviewed prisoners and staff, reviewed documentation and data, and then sat down and wrote, in measured but unsparing professional language, exactly what they found. Because when you read those reports, and they are publicly available, anyone can read them, the picture they paint is one that deserves to be shared as widely as possible. HMP Berwyn has been inspected multiple times since its opening in 2017. And with each successive inspection, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. The early inspections raised concerns but acknowledged the newness of the facility and the genuine intentions of many of those working within it. There was a degree of institutional grace extended, a sense that some of these problems might be teething issues, early operational challenges that a new prison would naturally face in its first years. But as the inspections continued, and as the same problems reappeared, year after year, in the same categories, with the same severity, that grace wore thin. By the time of the inspections in the early 2020s, the language in the reports had hardened considerably. The inspectors were no longer merely raising concerns. They were documenting entrenched, systemic failures. In one particularly significant inspection, Chief Inspector of Prisons issued findings that struck at the very heart of what HMP Berwyn was supposed to be. On safety, the most fundamental expectation of any prison, inspectors found levels of violence and self-harm that were described as too high. The drug problem inside the facility was documented as persistent and damaging. Men were not safe enough. Staff were not safe enough. The environment, despite its modern infrastructure, was generating the same human harm as far older, far less well-resourced facilities. The specific finding on the care of prisoners at risk of self-harm and suicide was among the most serious in the entire inspection record. The quality of account case management, the process designed to protect the most vulnerable men inside the prison, was described as inconsistent and insufficiently rigorous. For a prison that had specifically marketed itself as a humane, welfare-focused environment, this finding cut directly against the core of its identity. On respect, the category in which inspectors assess the daily lived experience of prisoners, including their access to services, the quality of their interactions with staff, and the basic conditions of their lives, ratings at HMP Berwyn were not where they needed to be for a facility claiming to represent a better model of incarceration. Men reported difficulties accessing basic services. Healthcare access remained a source of consistent complaint. The sense that the prison's management genuinely respected the dignity and humanity of its population, a foundational requirement for any rehabilitative model, was not universally evidenced. On purposeful activity, as we have already discussed, the inspector's findings were damning. Poor. The lowest rating. In a rehabilitation prison. And on rehabilitation itself, the headline purpose of the entire Berwyn experiment, inspectors found that the vision and the reality continued to diverge in fundamental ways. The proportion of prisoners engaging meaningfully in rehabilitation programs. The quality and consistency of those programs. The evidence of outcomes, of men actually changing in demonstrable, measurable ways that would reduce their likelihood of reoffending. None of it was where it needed to be. The Chief Inspector of Prisons, whose role is as close to a moral auditor of the prison system as the UK possesses, did not mince words in their published commentary on HMP Berwyn's performance. The inspection reports noted, with particular frustration, that many of the same concerns raised in earlier inspections remained unresolved. That action plans had been produced and responses had been issued, but that the improvements had either not materialized, or had materialized in partial, inconsistent ways that had not fundamentally changed the experience of the men living inside the prison. This is a pattern familiar to anyone who follows prison inspection in the UK. The cycle of inspection, report, action plan, partial response, next inspection revealing the same problems. It is a pattern that speaks to something deeper than poor management at any individual facility. It speaks to a systemic failure of investment, of political will, and of a fundamental societal ambivalence about whether the people inside prisons actually deserve the resources needed to genuinely rehabilitate them. But at HMP Berwyn the pattern had a particular sting. Because this prison had been explicitly set up as the exception to that pattern. It had been designed, funded, built, and marketed specifically as the place where things would be different. Where the old cycles would be broken. Where a new model would prove itself. And the inspectors were documenting, repeatedly and in formal published language, that the exception had failed to materialize. There is a phrase that appears, in various forms, across multiple HMP Berwyn inspection reports that deserves particular attention. The inspectors repeatedly note the gap between the prison's stated ambitions and its operational delivery. Between the vision of HMP Berwyn and the reality of HMP Berwyn. That gap, that space between what was promised and what was delivered, is not an abstraction. It is measured in waiting lists. In cancelled education sessions. In men who arrived at HMP Berwyn with substance addictions and left with those addictions intact. In incidents of violence that were preventable. In moments of crisis that went unaddressed until they became emergencies. The reports are public. They are available to read. And they constitute one of the most comprehensive documented critiques of a UK prison's failure to live up to its own stated purpose ever published. But perhaps most striking of all is what the inspectors consistently found when they asked the men inside HMP Berwyn what they thought. Because the prisoners themselves, the men whose entire lives were being shaped by whether this institution was working or not, had opinions. Clear ones. And many of those opinions, when aggregated across inspection surveys, told a consistent story of men who had arrived at HMP Berwyn with at least some hope that this different-sounding prison might actually deliver something different, and who had found, in the day-to-day reality of life inside, that the promise had not been kept. The human cost, life as a staff member at HMP Berwyn. In every story about what goes wrong inside a prison, the conversation naturally focuses on the prisoners. And rightly so, they are the most vulnerable people in the equation. Their lives, their safety, their futures are directly shaped by whether the institution housing them functions as it should. But there is another group of people whose story is rarely told with the depth it deserves. The people who go to work inside that institution every day. Who put on their uniform, badge up, walk through the gate, and spend 8, 9, 10 hours inside an environment that carries risk, psychological weight, and operational pressure that most people outside those walls cannot fully imagine. The prison officers, the healthcare workers, the teachers, the program facilitators, the psychologists, the governors, the staff of HMP Berwyn. Their experience of this prison is, in many ways, as revealing as the experience of the prisoners themselves. Because the failures and pressures that affect staff are directly connected to the failures and pressures that affect the men in their care. These things cannot be separated. The Prison Officers Association, the trade union representing frontline staff, has been vocal about conditions at HMP Berwyn for years. Their concerns, raised through official channels, through media statements, and through engagement with inspectors, paint a picture of a workforce under sustained and serious pressure. From early in the prison's operational life, staffing levels were a constant tension. The model on which Berwyn was designed, using technology and a degree of prisoner self-management to offset the need for high staff-to-prisoner ratios, was, in the view of many frontline officers, fundamentally inadequate for the actual demands of the environment. When violence broke out, and violence did break out, regularly, officers needed to respond rapidly and in sufficient numbers. When a prisoner experienced a mental health crisis, and those crises happened daily in a facility housing 2,000 men, an officer needed to be present, informed, and supported. When the environment on a wing became tense, when the subtle social dynamics of a prison population shifted in ways that experienced officers can sense before they become visible, someone needed to be there to read it and respond. Staff at HMP Berwyn described working in conditions where they were covering too much ground, managing too many men, and operating without the backup they needed consistently available. The sheer physical scale of the prison, one of the largest in Wales, meant that response times to incidents could be longer than in smaller facilities. That minutes matter in those moments is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is a physical reality of what it means to manage a violent incident in a large, complex building. The psychological toll on prison staff has been increasingly recognized in recent years, though still not adequately addressed. Working in an environment of chronic potential danger, managing human trauma on a daily basis, seeing self-harm, witnessing violence, managing the acute mental health crises of men in desperate states, this work leaves marks. Post-traumatic stress disorder among prison officers is documented and real. Burnout rates are high. Sickness absence in the prison service has historically been significantly above the national public sector average. And at a large, high-pressure facility like HMP Berwyn, where the operational demands were consistently running ahead of the resources to meet them, those pressures were magnified. Staff assaults at HMP Berwyn were also a documented reality. Officers being physically attacked by prisoners. Members of the healthcare team facing threatening behavior. Education staff placed in unsafe situations. These incidents, documented in the prison's own data and referenced in inspection reports, represent real physical harm to real people doing a difficult, important, and chronically undervalued job. The governor of HMP Berwyn, and the prison has seen leadership transitions since its opening, faced a management challenge of extraordinary complexity. Running a facility of this scale, with this population, on the resources provided, while simultaneously being held accountable for the delivery of an ambitious rehabilitation vision that had never been adequately resourced, is an almost impossible brief. Several governors of large, troubled UK prisons have spoken publicly in recent years about the impossible position they find themselves in. Accountable for outcomes they cannot control. Given responsibility without the authority or resources to fulfill it. Expected to deliver rehabilitation on a budget designed for mere containment. At HMP Berwyn, this tension was structural. The prison had been set up with goals that exceeded its resources from day one. And the people running it, governors, managers, heads of department, were being asked to bridge that gap through willpower, creativity, and a commitment to the model that the government itself had never truly funded adequately. When inspection reports criticized HMP Berwyn, they were, in a fundamental sense, criticizing the consequences of political decisions made long before any individual governor took up their post. The decision to build a large rehabilitation prison without fully funding its healthcare. Without commissioning adequate mental health provision. Without ensuring that the education and vocational training offer would be staffed to the level required. Without establishing the staffing ratios that the complexity of the environment genuinely demanded. These were not decisions made by prison officers or governors. They were made by ministers and civil servants and commissioners sitting in offices far from North Wales. But it was the staff of HMP Berwyn who lived with the consequences of those decisions every day. It was a prison officer managing a wing short of staff who had to make impossible decisions about which men to prioritize when two situations arose simultaneously. It was a mental health practitioner with a caseload far beyond what was clinically manageable who had to make judgments about who was most at risk today when everybody on the list needed more than they were receiving. It was a teacher whose class was cancelled for the 5th time in a month because movement had been suspended due to an incident elsewhere in the prison, watching the educational progress of the men in her class stall and erode. And it was the officers who had to go home at the end of their shift carrying what they had seen. Carrying the weight of a system that asked too much of them. That valued them too little. That was breaking, daily, in ways that were as visible to them as anything recorded in any official report, but that rarely made it into the language of press releases and government action plans. The story of HMP Berwyn is not just a story about prisoners. It is a story about the human cost of institutional failure on everyone inside those walls. On every person, in any role, whose life was shaped by whether this prison worked as it was supposed to. And that cost, measured in assaults, in burnout, in trauma, in the gradual erosion of belief that things could be better, was being paid every day. Drugs, phones and contraband, the war inside the walls. There is a war being fought inside HMP Berwyn. It does not make headlines in the way that a conventional war does. There are no front lines that can be drawn on a map. No formal declarations. No uniforms that distinguish one side from the other. But it is a war nonetheless, a constant, grinding, dangerous conflict between the people who run the prison and the forces that operate within it to undermine it. And at the center of that war are 3 things: drugs, mobile phones, and the contraband networks that bring them inside. Understanding this war is essential to understanding why HMP Berwyn has struggled so profoundly. Because the drug and contraband problem inside the prison is not a side issue. It is not a minor operational inconvenience sitting at the margins of the bigger story. It is, in many ways, the root from which a significant proportion of the violence, the health crises, and the rehabilitation failures grow. Let us start with drugs. The dominant drug problem at HMP Berwyn, as at prisons across England and Wales, has for years been synthetic cannabinoids. Spice. Black Mamba. K2. These substances belong to a family of psychoactive chemicals synthesized in laboratories, originally developed, in some cases, for legitimate research purposes before being diverted and sold as recreational drugs. What makes synthetic cannabinoids so uniquely destructive in the prison environment, beyond their severe physical and psychological effects, is their relationship with drug detection systems. Traditional urine drug testing in prisons was designed to detect cannabis, heroin, cocaine, and other established controlled substances. The synthetic cannabinoids, in their many and constantly evolving chemical variations, routinely escape detection through standard testing. By the time the testing systems caught up with one formulation, a slightly altered version had arrived that defeated the tests again. This made spice, in the context of a prison environment, almost uniquely profitable. A relatively small quantity could be sold for enormous sums, with a premium attached precisely because the drug was difficult to detect. And it was physically light, which made it easier to smuggle. The methods by which drugs get into modern UK prisons, including a modern facility like HMP Berwyn, are numerous and constantly evolving. Letters and parcels soaked in synthetic cannabinoid solution, which dried invisibly on the paper and could be smoked once inside, were a primary early method. As prisons introduced measures to detect soaked paper, methods adapted. Drones carrying packages became a significant vector, flying over the perimeter wall and dropping payloads into exercise yards or accessible outdoor areas. The drone problem at HMP Berwyn and across the wider UK prison estate became severe enough in the late 2010s that the Ministry of Justice invested significantly in anti-drone technology, detection systems, jamming devices, increased perimeter monitoring. But the technology race between prison security and those attempting to defeat it has never fully resolved in the security side's favor. New drone models, different drop patterns, corrupted staff, a painful but documented reality in prisons across the country, providing intelligence to those on the outside about when and where to fly. And then there are mobile phones. The ban on mobile phones inside UK prisons exists for obvious security reasons. Phones allow prisoners to coordinate criminal activity from inside. They allow threats to be made to witnesses. They allow the organization of drug deliveries. They allow the management of criminal enterprises that continue to operate despite their leaders' incarceration. But mobile phones inside prisons also serve purposes that are far more mundane and human, keeping in contact with family, accessing news, maintaining the thin threads of human connection that are so important to men serving long sentences. And this complexity around mobile phones, the fact that they are simultaneously a genuine security risk and a deeply human lifeline, makes the policy discussion genuinely difficult. At HMP Berwyn, illicit mobile phones were documented as a persistent problem. The volumes of phones found during searches, in cells, in common areas, concealed in food packages, thrown over perimeter walls, were significant. And with those phones came SIM cards, chargers, and in some cases more sophisticated communication capabilities that served criminal networks both inside and outside the prison. The management of contraband at HMP Berwyn involved constant security activity. Intelligence-led cell searches. Body scanners. The prison invested in body scanning technology to reduce the ability of individuals to conceal items on their person on entry. Dedicated prison intelligence teams monitoring communication, watching for patterns, building pictures of who was organizing what inside the facility. But the fundamental challenge was, and remains, one of scale. Over 2,000 men in a large, complex facility, with multiple entry points, multiple daily movements, and a constant flow of mail, visits, deliveries, and external contact. Identifying and intercepting every piece of contraband, in that environment, is essentially impossible. The security systems reduce the problem significantly. They do not eliminate it. The economics of the prison drug trade also deserve examination, because they reveal something important about the social dynamics at HMP Berwyn and prisons like it. Inside prison, synthetic cannabinoids and mobile phones are extraordinarily valuable. A smartphone that costs £80 on the high street might sell for several £100s inside a prison. A small quantity of spice that would be worth relatively little outside carries enormous value inside. This creates powerful financial incentives, for people on the outside willing to be involved in supply, for corrupted staff, and for prisoners who manage and control the internal distribution. The men who control drug supply on a prison wing have power. Real power. Over other prisoners who become dependent on their product. Over men in debt for drugs they cannot pay for. The enforcement of those debts, the violence, the threats, the intimidation, is part of the structural reality of the prison drug economy. And it maps directly onto the violence statistics that inspection reports have documented so thoroughly. When a man assaults another man on a wing at HMP Berwyn, and the violence data shows this happening regularly, there is a significant likelihood that the assault is connected, directly or indirectly, to the drug economy operating on that wing. Debt enforcement. Territorial disputes over distribution. Retaliation for interference with a supply chain. The staff response to this environment is a study in sustained, grinding professional pressure. Intelligence officers working to map the networks. Wing officers watching for the subtle signs that something is wrong, an unusual tension, a pattern of cell visits that suggests dealing, a prisoner's behavior changing in ways that suggest drug use. Healthcare staff managing the acute medical crises caused by spice, men found collapsed in their cells, or in states of extreme paranoia and agitation that required emergency medical response. Every one of those incidents represents real danger. To the prisoner. To staff. To other men on the wing who have nothing to do with the drug trade but live in the environment it creates. And then there is the question of what the persistent presence of drugs inside HMP Berwyn means for its rehabilitation mission. If a man enters HMP Berwyn with a heroin or crack cocaine dependency, and the goal is to address that dependency, to provide treatment, to support recovery, to give him the tools and the clean time to rebuild a life without substances, what happens when a different, highly addictive substance is freely available inside the prison itself? What happens when spice is being traded on the wing where he lives? When the culture around him includes regular drug use? When the isolation and hopelessness of long-term incarceration creates a powerful pull toward anything that provides temporary relief, however destructive? The answer, documented in outcomes data and in the testimony of men who have lived through it, is that the rehabilitation mission is profoundly undermined. Men who arrive with one addiction can leave with another. Men who were clean can relapse inside. Men who never used drugs before prison can develop dependencies inside. The drug environment inside HMP Berwyn was not just a security problem. It was a direct assault on the central purpose of the institution. And that is perhaps the bitterest irony of all in the story of HMP Berwyn. A prison built specifically to break the cycle of reoffending. Built specifically to address the substance dependencies that drive so much of that cycle. Containing, within its modern, purpose-built walls, a thriving drug economy that was reproducing and deepening exactly the addictions it was supposed to be curing. The verdict: what HMP Berwyn tells us about Britain's broken promise. We have come a long way inside these walls. We have walked the corridors of a prison that was supposed to change everything. We have looked at the inspection reports. We have sat with the statistics. We have listened to what the staff endured and what the prisoners experienced. We have traced the drugs moving through the wings, the violence building in the recreation yards, the healthcare waiting lists growing longer, the education classrooms sitting half empty or locked altogether. And now, at the end of this journey, it is time to ask the hardest question of all. Not what went wrong at HMP Berwyn. We know what went wrong. The inspectors told us. The data told us. The men who lived and worked inside those walls told us. The hardest question is this: why? Why did a prison built with genuine ambition, with modern architecture, with the stated intention of doing things differently, why did it end up producing the same outcomes as the crumbling Victorian jails it was designed to replace? Why did the promise fail? The answer is not simple. But it is, when you look honestly at the evidence, deeply uncomfortable for the government that built HMP Berwyn and for the successive governments that managed it. Because the truth is that HMP Berwyn was never really a bold new experiment in rehabilitation. It was a presentation of a bold new experiment in rehabilitation. There is a difference, a vast and consequential difference, between building a modern facility with modern architecture and actually funding the systems, the staff, the services, and the sustained investment that genuine rehabilitation requires. Between announcing a new model and actually commissioning it properly. The building was funded. The walls were built. The cells were constructed to a higher standard than most. The classrooms were installed. The workshops were equipped. And then, at the crucial moment, the resources required to actually run all of that to the standard needed were not consistently provided at the necessary scale. The healthcare service was commissioned below the level of need. The staffing model was designed around cost efficiency rather than the complexity of the environment. The education provision was delivered by a contracted provider operating under budget pressures. The mental health service was overwhelmed from the start. And the systemic oversight, the accountability mechanisms that should have ensured that action plans were delivered and problems resolved, proved insufficient to the task. In 2022, and again in subsequent inspections, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons returned to HMP Berwyn and found many of the same problems they had been documenting since 2017. 5 years after opening. After multiple inspection cycles. After multiple action plans. After multiple ministerial commitments to improvement. The violence was still too high. The drug problem was still present and damaging. The healthcare provision was still struggling with the scale of demand. The purposeful activity offer, the education, the vocational training, was still inconsistently delivered and reaching too few men in too few meaningful ways. 5 years. And the core problems remained. That fact alone tells you something important. These are not management failures that a better governor or a more motivated staff team could solve. These are structural failures, failures built into the design of the institution by the decisions made about how to fund and commission it. And structural failures require structural solutions. What would a structural solution actually look like? Criminologists, prison reform campaigners, and experienced practitioners have been arguing for years that the answer is clear, even if it is politically difficult. It means adequately funding the healthcare provision inside prisons so that it genuinely matches the scale of need, not a version of healthcare that is good enough to avoid scandal, but genuinely equivalent to what a person with the same health needs would receive in the community outside. It means commissioning and staffing mental health services inside prisons at a level that reflects the extraordinary concentration of mental health need in that population. Not bare minimum provision, but genuine, intensive, evidence-based mental health care. It means staffing prisons at the levels actually required to run safe, stable environments, not the levels required to keep the budget spreadsheet looking acceptable. It means funding education and vocational training at the quality and consistency needed to actually change outcomes, with genuine accountability for whether those programs are producing real-world results, not just participation numbers. And it means, perhaps most fundamentally, a genuine political commitment to rehabilitation as a national priority. Not as a talking point. Not as a press release. As a funded, sustained, evaluated program of action. None of this is cheap. None of it is politically easy in an environment where the narrative around prisons is often driven by populist instinct, where being seen to be tough on criminals frequently generates more political capital than being seen to invest in their rehabilitation. But the cost of not doing it is also real. And it is borne not only by the men inside HMP Berwyn, though they bear the most direct and personal cost, but by wider society. Every man who leaves HMP Berwyn without his drug dependency addressed, without the skills or qualifications to find legitimate employment, without the mental health support he needed, without the rehabilitative experience that might have changed his trajectory, that man has a significantly elevated risk of reoffending, of returning to prison, of causing harm in his community, of costing the justice system, the health system, and the welfare system far more than the investment in his rehabilitation would ever have cost. Reoffending costs the UK economy billions of pounds every year. The human cost, in crime victims, in families destroyed, in communities damaged, is incalculable. HMP Berwyn was supposed to be part of the answer to that problem. It was supposed to prove that investing in genuine rehabilitation reduces that cost. That treating prisoners as human beings capable of change, and giving them the tools to change, produces better outcomes for everyone. And here is the thing, the deeply frustrating, infuriating, genuinely important thing, that vision was not wrong. The evidence base for rehabilitation in reducing reoffending is robust. It exists. It is real. Education in prison reduces reoffending. Addressing substance dependency reduces reoffending. Treating mental illness reduces reoffending. Stable employment after release reduces reoffending. These are not opinions. They are findings from decades of research across multiple countries. The vision that drove HMP Berwyn was, in its core principles, sound. What was not sound was the gap between that vision and the actual political and financial commitment made to deliver it. And so we arrive, at the end of this story, not at a conclusion, because HMP Berwyn is still there, still operational, still housing over 2,000 men in the hills of North Wales, but at a reckoning. A reckoning with what it means to make a promise to some of the most vulnerable and socially marginalized people in the country, men who have often been let down by every other institution that was supposed to help them, from childhood onward, and then fail to keep it. A reckoning with a prison system that is, by almost every meaningful metric, in crisis. Not because the people working within it are bad people. Not because rehabilitation is an impossible dream. But because the political will and the financial commitment required to do it properly have never consistently materialized. And a reckoning with our own social attitudes. With the quiet social assumption, which drives so much of the political calculus around prisons, that the men inside do not really deserve better. That they made their choices. That investment in their rehabilitation is a luxury the country cannot afford or a leniency the public will not accept. That assumption, quiet, widespread, rarely examined, is the deepest root of the failure at HMP Berwyn. Because you cannot build a rehabilitation prison in a society that has not committed to rehabilitation as a genuine moral priority. You cannot staff it adequately, fund it adequately, or hold it accountable to the right outcomes if the underlying political consensus is that these men are not really worth the investment. The men inside HMP Berwyn, every single one of them, arrived in the world as infants. As children. With the same fundamental humanity as every person watching this video right now. The road from that beginning to a cell in North Wales was paved, for most of them, with circumstances that were not entirely of their own making. Poverty. Abuse. Addiction. Trauma. Untreated mental illness. Educational failure. Social exclusion. None of that excuses harm caused. But it does raise a question about what justice actually means. About whether a justice system that locks men away in a facility it never adequately funded, in conditions that inspectors repeatedly found wanting, pursuing a rehabilitation model it never truly committed to delivering, whether that system is genuinely serving justice. Or whether it is simply managing human suffering at the cheapest acceptable cost and calling it something better than it is. HMP Berwyn was supposed to answer that question with a yes. With a model that proved rehabilitation worked when properly invested in. Instead it became, in the years since its opening, a case study in what happens when the gap between political promise and operational reality is allowed to persist, inspection after inspection, year after year, without the fundamental structural changes needed to close it. The prison is still there. The men are still inside. The inspectors will go back again. More reports will be written. More action plans will be issued. And somewhere in a cell in that modern, purpose-built, ambitious, struggling, failing, still standing institution in North Wales, a man is sitting. Waiting. For a system that promised him something better than this. Whether that promise will ever truly be kept remains, as of this moment, an open question. But it is a question that all of us, not just the inspectors, not just the politicians, not just the prison service, have a stake in answering. Because a society is judged not by how it treats its most powerful citizens, but by how it treats the people at the very bottom of its pile. And on that measure, by the evidence of HMP Berwyn, there is still a very long way to go. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you angry, or made you see something differently, please share it. Because these stories need to be heard. The men in those cells, and the staff walking those corridors, deserve to have someone paying attention. Thank you for watching.